A fork dropped. The sound was small, but it split the silence in half. Every face at the long table turned toward the woman in the black uniform, the one who hadn't moved. "On your knees," the CEO said. The words landed flat, heavy, deliberate. They didn't echo because the restaurant itself had stopped breathing. Lila Carter stood motionless, one hand still resting on the edge of a silver tray. The light above her caught the line of her jaw, the faint tremor in her fingers, the way she didn't bow her head. Across from her, Damian Cole, the man whose company's name gleamed from half the towers in the city, sat back in his chair, his cufflinks glinting like small blades. Around them, the air turned electric. The servers at the other tables froze mid-step. Guests stared down at their plates, pretending to adjust napkins or check their phones, pretending not to witness what everyone was witnessing. Lila didn't speak. She didn't look away either. Damian's expression stayed calm, amused, even as if this were part of the service, a test, a game that ended only when he decided it did. "Do you know who you're speaking to?" he asked quietly. She did. Everyone did. His face had been on magazine covers. His words had moved markets. His arrogance filled the room more completely than the scent of truffle oil and dry-aged steak. But tonight his voice was something else sharp, controlled the voice of a man who believed obedience was a form of tribute. Lila's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Someone at the table laughed softly, uncertainly. Another guest murmured, "Damian, please." But he raised a hand, silencing them. "This one," he said, looking at her the way someone studies a flaw in fine glassware, needs to remember her place. The tray in her hands wobbled slightly, but she steadied it before anyone noticed. For a moment, the restaurant became a photograph, perfect framed cruel. The pianist stopped playing. The candles flickered. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Lila placed the tray down slowly on the edge of the table. "Is there something wrong with your order, sir?" she asked. Her voice was even, almost gentle. Damian's smile faltered just for an instant. "No," he said, just with the attitude. He leaned back, letting his voice carry. "Do you know how many people would trade everything to serve here? To serve me?" No one answered. They didn't have to. This wasn't a question, it was a reminder. The kind of reminder powerful men gave to prove they could. Lila clasped her hands in front of her apron, eyes steady on the tablecloth, not him. Her restraint was mistaken for weakness. Damian mistook silence for surrender. He pushed his chair back slightly, crossing one leg over the other. "Then kneel," he said. The words came quietly this time, almost soft, almost intimate. The kind of command that was meant to break a person quietly, cleanly, without witnesses, except tonight there were dozens. A woman near the end of the table inhaled sharply, then looked away. Someone else whispered, "He's serious." The tension became physical. It pressed on skin, on breath, on thought. Lila didn't move. She stood there, her uniform perfectly still against the polished marble floor, her reflection clear in its surface. Damian watched her, a faint smirk forming again. "Still nothing?" he asked. "I admire persistence, but I don't tolerate defiance." The manager appeared at the edge of the dining room, panicked, unsure if he should intervene. "Mr. Cole, perhaps?" "Not now," Damian said without turning his head. He wanted the room to see. That was the point. This was theater. And Lila understood that. She had learned long ago that humiliation wasn't random. It was ritual. It kept the powerful entertained. But tonight something in her had shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was just the weight of being treated like an object for too long. Whatever it was, she felt the heat of it behind her ribs, steady, cold, and focused. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough to force everyone to lean in. "I don't kneel for cruelty," she said. The words weren't loud, but they cracked the stillness in half. Damian blinked, his smirk slipping entirely this time. The guests turned their eyes toward him, toward her, then back again. Someone whispered, "Did she just—" He laughed once too loud. "You're brave," he said, "or stupid. Either way, you'll regret it." He reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and tossed a bill toward the floor. It drifted down like an insult given form. "Pick it up," he said. "It'll pay for your next job interview." The paper rested against the marble. The silence returned thicker, colder. Lila looked down at it. Then she took a slow step forward. Every eye followed her. She knelt not in shame, but in calculation. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, her spine perfectly straight. For a moment, Damian's smile returned. He leaned back, satisfied. And then she did something no one expected. She picked up the bill, folded it neatly in half, and placed it on the table in front of him. "You dropped this," she said. Her tone was polite, her hands steady. A ripple of sound moved through the room, half gasp, half disbelief. No one laughed this time. Damien didn't know what to say. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. And then the pianist, perhaps out of nerves, began playing again a few hesitant notes that somehow filled the silence instead of breaking it. Lila turned, walked back toward the service corridor, and disappeared behind the double doors. The manager stood frozen, staring after her. Damien's guests exchanged looks they didn't dare voice. No one mentioned that for a single moment everyone in that room had wanted to stand. If you've ever watched someone humiliate another person just to feel powerful, you know how quiet the room gets when someone refuses to break. That kind of silence stays with you. It changes the air. Sometimes people write to tell stories like that stories about standing up when everyone else looks away. Those stories matter. They remind us that dignity isn't loud, it's steady. And if you're drawn to moments like this, moments where truth stands taller than status, stay close. There are more like her out there waiting to be heard. The noise in the kitchen came back in waves, clattering pans, sharp orders, the hiss of steam. No one mentioned what had just happened in the dining room, but everyone knew. When power explodes in public, its echo doesn't stop at the door. Lila Carter set the tray down on the stainless steel counter. Her fingers were still trembling slightly, though her face gave nothing away. Sarah, the hostess, leaned closer. He said that, in front of everyone. Lila nodded once. And you? What did you do? I gave him his money back. Sarah stared at her. You're insane. A hollow laugh left Lila's throat. Maybe she said, but he's worse. From the corner, the head chef, a tall, quiet man who never involved himself in front-of-house drama, watched them for a long second before saying, some people think humiliation is a currency. They spend it until they go bankrupt. Then he went back to slicing lemons. No one replied. The night continued. Tables emptied, glasses clinked, footsteps softened into closing routine, the kind of rhythm that helped people forget. But forgetting wasn't something Lila had ever been good at. When she finished her shift, the city outside felt colder than usual. Manhattan's skyline burned in the distance like a constellation of unreachable fires. She walked home alone, the sound of her shoes on the pavement keeping time with the thought she couldn't shake. He looked at me like I didn't exist. It wasn't new. She'd seen that look before in meetings, in interviews, in every space where she was supposed to be invisible. But tonight, something about it had cracked open a memory she had buried deep. A boardroom. Her father's voice, steady but tired, explaining that the contract had been restructured. And a man across the table smiling faintly as he signed away a legacy, twirling a gold pen before the ink met the page. That man had been Damien Cole. Her father had died 6 months later, his name erased from the firm he built. His design still shaped the skyline, including the original interior concept that would become the Selborne's first incarnation, but no one remembered who drew them. Lila had been 22. Now, 6 years later, she served drinks in a restaurant that catered to the same men who had dismantled her family's life. The irony was perfect, the punishment almost poetic. But she didn't call it punishment anymore. She called it patience. By morning, the video had surfaced online. A guest from the night before had filmed it, a 30-second clip showing Damien Cole ordering a waitress to kneel. It wasn't the full exchange, just enough. The comments multiplied like sparks. Some condemned him, some defended him. Most were shocked. By noon, the video had reached 1 million views. Within the first 48 hours, it crossed multiple millions. The story outran context. At the restaurant, the staff moved as if on eggshells. The manager tried to act calm, but his phone kept buzzing. Public relations nightmare, he muttered under his breath, pacing between the kitchen and the front desk. Lila said nothing. She worked her shift, silent, precise, her expression unreadable. When the general manager pulled her aside, his voice was hushed. He called. "Mr. Cole." "Yes, he's furious. Says you staged it." Lila blinked. "You think I did?" I think the manager said, lowering his voice, that he's the kind of man who can ruin lives with a phone call. "You should stay off the grid for a while." She almost smiled. "I don't have a grid to be off." That evening, a man came into the restaurant, older, elegant, wearing a tailored gray suit that had clearly been made decades ago but still fit perfectly. He asked to speak to Lila Carter. She assumed it was another complaint, another echo of the scandal. but when she approached the man, smiled kindly. "I was hoping you might have a few minutes," he said. "My name is Arthur Marin. I knew your father." She froze. "You knew him?" He nodded. "I was his attorney before Cole bought him out." She led him to a quiet corner table, uncertain, cautious. Arthur sat down, slowly resting his cane against the table. "I saw the video," he said. "That was courage, Miss Carter. You didn't just refuse to kneel, you reminded a room what dignity looks like." Lila shook her head. "It wasn't courage. It was reflex. Reflexes tell us who we really are," he said. He paused, studying her expression. "You're not done with him, are you?" She didn't answer. Arthur leaned closer. "There's something you should know. When your father's company collapsed, it wasn't clean. There were documents, transactions that didn't add up. I tried to fight it, but Cole's legal team buried everything under corporate confidentiality." Lila looked up sharply. "You're saying it wasn't legal. I'm saying it was clever," Arthur said. "Which is worse?" The memory of her father's face, defeated but proud, flashed across her mind. "Do you still have those records?" "I have copies," he said, eyes narrowing. "And I've been waiting for someone with your last name to ask." Outside, the city glowed in glass and steel. Inside, under that soft restaurant light, something ancient stirred between two people who had lost the same man to the same kind of cruelty. Lila folded her napkin carefully and stood. "Mr. Marin," she said, "if you're right, I want to see everything." He smiled faintly. "Then we'll begin tomorrow." Begin. As she walked home that night, her reflection followed her through every window she passed, small, silent, steady. The world around her was loud with traffic and light, but inside her chest was a stillness sharper than anger. Damian Cole had thought humiliation was an ending. He hadn't realized it was an introduction. Morning sunlight spilled through the high windows of the law library, cutting across stacks of casebooks and rows of tired faces. Lila Carter sat among them, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of black coffee. Her shift had ended only 3 hours earlier, but she couldn't sleep. Not after last night. Not after Arthur Marin's words. He'd given her an address, a small brownstone office tucked between corporate towers. 9 a.m. sharp, he'd said. We start there. Now, sitting before a pile of open documents, she realized what they meant. Arthur was already waiting when she arrived, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by folders marked with old corporate seals. His desk looked like an excavation site of buried truths. These, he said, tapping a thin stack of printed records, are Cole Industries acquisition papers from 6 years ago. Your father's company appears here. He turned a page. But the numbers, these don't add up. He pushed the papers toward her. Lila scanned them, tracing each figure like a pulse. Her father's signature sat at the bottom of one page, neat, deliberate, but above it was another in colder ink, Damian Cole. See this clause, Arthur said. It looks standard, but it's a trigger clause, a mechanism to collapse shareholder value if certain targets weren't met. Targets he rigged. Lila exhaled slowly. So it was planned. Every step he said. Her throat tightened. For years, she'd believed her father lost everything because he was too idealistic, too trusting. Now she saw it for what it was, a design, not a downfall. After her shift that night at Selborne, Lila went straight to Arthur's office. The hours stretched into night. He and Lila pieced together documents, timelines, emails, threads of a pattern that led to one conclusion: fraud disguised as brilliance. Every signature Damian Cole made in those years bled arrogance. Every acquisition hid a theft behind it. You'll need proof that the trigger clause was deliberate, Arthur said, rubbing his temples. That's the key. Lila nodded. There's someone who knows. My father's CFO, Thomas Crane. He disappeared after the takeover. Arthur looked up. Find him. The next day she did. Thomas Crane lived in a quiet suburb, a man hollowed out by silence. His house smelled of dust and resignation. When he opened the door and saw her, he froze. You look like him, he said. Your father. She didn't waste time. I need the truth. He hesitated. That truth cost me everything. It cost my father his life, she said. Thomas stared at her for a long time, then motioned her inside. On his kitchen table lay a folder worn and yellowed. I kept copies, he said. Couldn't bring myself to destroy them. Inside were transaction records, emails, one in particular bearing Damian Cole's digital signature instructing a proxy firm to trigger the collapse days before the takeover. The signature had already been validated against the company's internal certificate authority, and the instructions server logs quietly preserved by a departing systems engineer matched the timestamp to the minute. It was the smoking gun. By evening, Arthur had everything. "This isn't just unethical," he said, scanning the printouts. "It's criminal." He looked up at her. "We can expose him." Lila's expression didn't change. "Not yet." Arthur frowned. "What are you planning?" "Something public," she said. "Something he can't bury in paperwork." 3 days later, Damian Cole hosted a gala at the Selborne, the same restaurant, now his stage once more. The city's elite gathered beneath crystal chandeliers, pretending not to know what they'd read online. It was a PR-crafted redemption gala to refocus public perception. When Lila stepped into the room in her black uniform, the air shifted again. The evening crew was short-staffed. She had volunteered to swap into the shift. Some of the guests whispered her name, others looked away. Damian saw her and smiled like a man amused by a ghost. "Back to serve the kings," he said quietly as she approached. "Maybe just the truth," she replied. He laughed, thinking it was wit. "You'll find that truth pays poorly." But this time she wasn't serving drinks. She was setting the stage. Arthur Marin was seated near the back, a silent witness. He nodded once as she passed. Everything was in place. The right people, the right attention, the right moment. The chandelier light shimmered over hundreds of glasses, turning the entire hall into a soft cage of gold. Every seat at the Selborne was taken. Journalists, investors, public figures, the kind who smiled for cameras and whispered for leverage. At the center of it all sat Damian Cole. Perfect posture, perfect control. He was the kind of man who built his own myth and called it destiny. A gold pen flashed in his breast pocket when he gestured. Some habits survive scandal. Lila Carter moved quietly through the crowd, carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes. No one stopped her. No one looked twice. She had become what powerful people preferred: present, useful, invisible. But invisibility can be the sharpest disguise. Arthur Marin sat near the corner, his expression unreadable. In his breast pocket was a single envelope documents that could end Damian's empire before the night was over. Lila didn't need to look at him to know it was there. She'd memorized every word, every signature, every lie. She approached the head table. Damian saw her and smiled with practiced charm. "Well," he said, "if it isn't my favorite waitress." "Come to apologize." Her tone was flat. "I came to serve your table, sir." He laughed, leaning back. "You've got spirit. I like that." Lila set down the menus with quiet precision. Her reflection flickered in the polished silverware, calm, composed, unreadable. She was already standing beside the small lectern microphone reserved for the MC. Damian studied her. "You know you should thank me. That video made you famous. Not the kind of fame I asked for." "Fame never comes the way people ask," he said. "You'll learn that." The pianist shifted to a slower melody. The room quieted. Every movement felt deliberate, rehearsed. The perfect stage for humiliation or something else entirely. Damian stood raising his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began. "It's been a turbulent few weeks. But as you can see, life has a way of sorting out truth from noise." Polite laughter rippled around the room. He gestured toward Lila with his glass. "And speaking of truth here, she is living proof that forgiveness is possible if one knows her place." The laughter was thinner this time, hesitant. Lila didn't move. Her hands rested lightly at her sides. The whole room was watching, waiting for her to break, to leave, to react. Damian set his glass down and stepped closer. "So tell me, Miss Carter," he said, voice smooth and slow, "do you know how to show gratitude?" The words were familiar. The tone was the same one he used that night. Lila's heart pounded once, just once, before it steadied. Her reply came quiet, but clear. "I do." He smirked, then Neil. The room froze. Forks stopped midair. Conversations ended. Even the music faltered for a second. Every eye turned toward her again the same way they had before. Lila looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady. Then she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered herself not to the floor, but to one knee beside the table. Her head bowed slightly. Gasps spread like ripples. Damien exhaled, satisfied, his grin widening. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms slightly as if conducting an orchestra. "You see," he said. "Some lessons." He stopped. Lila's hand was on the table. Her other hand reached for the microphone stand beside it. She rose in one smooth motion, pressing the button with a steady click. Her voice filled the speakers, low, calm, cutting through the room like a line of glass. "I was told to kneel once before," she said. "Right here. Same man, same arrogance." The crowd stirred. Cameras lifted. The PR manager's face turned white. Damien froze, still standing, still smiling, but his jaw had locked. "Miss Carter," she kept speaking. "But tonight I'm not here to serve him. I'm here to serve a truth he buried 6 years ago." Arthur Marin stood from his seat at the back. The envelope was already in his hand. He walked toward the stage with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man carrying something irreversible. "Mr. Marin," Lila said softly into the microphone. "Would you read the names on those documents?" Arthur opened the envelope. "Robert Carter," he said, "founder of Carter Design, and Damien Cole, CEO of Cole Industries. The agreement you see here includes a fraudulent clause activated days before the acquisition one Mr. Cole personally authorized." The sound in the room changed, first a murmur, then disbelief, then silence again. Lila turned toward Damien. "You stole my father's company," she said quietly. "You called it business. You called it strategy. You called it survival." She paused. "I call it theft." Damien's mask cracked. "This is slander," he said, voice trembling with restrained fury. "You have no proof." Arthur held up the final page. His digital signature, he said, authenticated and time-stamped. "Server logs corroborate the order. The chain of custody has been preserved." Every phone in the room pointed toward them now. Every guest was filming. Every whisper became evidence. Lila's voice softened. "You asked me to kneel." She stepped closer. "But maybe it's time the room decides who should be standing." She set the microphone down. The sound of it touching the table echoed like a gavel. For a moment nobody moved. Then one person stood. A man at the far table, older, quiet. Then another. And another. Within seconds the entire restaurant was on its feet. No applause, no noise. Just the sound of chairs sliding back, a slow rising wave of human recognition. Damien Cole looked around, his control evaporating. His mouth opened, but no words came. He turned toward the exit, but the cameras followed him like judgment. Lila didn't move. She simply watched him go, her face calm, her breathing steady. When the door finally closed behind him, she exhaled once quietly, and the tension in the room released like a held breath. Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it." Lila shook her head. "No," she said softly. "They did." She looked around the room, the people standing not for her, but for what they'd all just seen, arrogance undone by truth. Cruelty answered by grace. The video spread before midnight. By dawn it had circled the globe. A grainy clip, 37 seconds long, a CEO demanding a woman kneel, a woman standing instead, and an entire restaurant rising to its feet. No narration, no commentary, just silence, the kind that said more than outrage ever could. By sunrise, headlines appeared in every language. Power meets its mirror. The waitress who made a room stand. Corporate empire shaken by truth. The footage came from a guest's phone, but it was Arthur's verified statement released quietly at 2:14 a.m. that turned spectacle into evidence. Attached to the video was a single document, the signed acquisition clause stamped dated authenticated. The internet didn't just watch. It investigated. Every journalist who'd once written glowing profiles of Damien Cole now tore through the same archives to find the cracks they'd ignored. Within 48 hours, Cole Industries' stock had fallen 17%. By evening of the second day, his legal team was in crisis mode. And through it all, Lila Carter stayed quiet. She didn't give interviews. She didn't post statements. She went to work as usual, clearing tables, wiping glass, answering questions with the same calm tone. The city moved around her loud and frantic while she carried the stillness of someone who had already said everything that mattered. Arthur Marin watched from his office, the blinds half closed against the chaos of flashing headlines. He had seen public takedowns before, but this one felt different. This wasn't vengeance. It was equilibrium returning to a tilted scale. He called her that evening. "You've done what courts rarely," Kenny said. "You reminded people that justice isn't an institution, it's a witness." Lila's voice on the other end was soft. "I didn't plan any of it." "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." He hesitated. "There will be fallout. Reporters, lawyers, opportunists. I expected that. You'll need protection." "I don't need protection," she said quietly. "Just truth." Arthur smiled faintly. "You sound like your father." The next night, the Selborne reopened under impossible attention. No cameras were allowed, no press, no speeches, just service as usual. But nothing felt usual anymore. Guests spoke in lower tones, the laughter cautious, the space somehow heavier. The marble floor, once a symbol of luxury, now carried memory. Somewhere in the city, Damien Cole was reportedly unavailable for comment. Rumors said his board had called an emergency meeting. Others said he'd fled. Inside the restaurant, however, everything felt suspended in the calm after a storm. When Lila entered, every employee paused, not out of pity, but out of acknowledgement. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. The chef nodded at her. "They're talking about making you a manager." She smiled faintly. "Let's just get through dinner." The lights dimmed. The pianist began again. Life resumed its rhythm, quieter now, more deliberate. At one of the back tables, a couple whispered softly, "She's the one from the video." "Don't stare," the man replied. "She looks like she wants peace." They were right. She didn't crave attention. All she wanted was space enough to breathe enough to remember that she had survived the gaze of cruelty and walked away unbroken. Later, when her shift ended, she stepped outside into the chill night air. Across the street, a crowd had gathered, small, respectful holding candles. Someone must have organized it online. They weren't protesters. They were witnesses. No chants. No signs. Just people standing silently in front of the restaurant's glass facade. A few held photos of family members who'd lost businesses, jobs, reputations to men like Damien Cole. Lila stopped at the curb, unsure whether to go forward or back. Then one of them, a young woman, noticed her and nodded once. No one said her name, no one clapped, but one by one they lifted their candles higher. The light reflected off the glass windows, scattering across the marble floor, inside the same floor where she had once been ordered to kneel. For a moment, Lila thought of her father. He used to say that every structure carries two kinds of weight, the kind that holds it up and the kind that threatens to bring it down. The secret, he said, was learning which was which. She looked at the lights, at the faces behind them, at the quiet gathering that had turned shame into solidarity. The weight tonight was the kind that held. Arthur arrived a few minutes later, coat collar up against the wind. "You see what you've done," he said softly. "I didn't do anything. That's what makes it beautiful," he said. He reminded people that silence isn't defeat, it's the start of an echo. He handed her an envelope. "For you." Inside was a formal notice SEC investigation into coal industries initiated. Lila stared at the letter for a long moment. "Will it change anything?" Arthur nodded once. "It already has." The hearing room was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the soft shuffle of papers. Rows of journalists filled the back seats, their eyes fixed on the long oak table at the center, where power was finally being questioned under oath. Damien Cole sat at one end, his once impeccable composure beginning to erode. His suit was still expensive, but it no longer fit the same way. His fingers fidgeted with a pen he didn't need. Across from him sat Arthur Marin, calm and deliberate, his files stacked neatly in front of him. Beside him, Lila Carter sat still, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for accuracy. The government panel's lead investigator, a woman with steel gray hair and a voice that didn't rise above measured civility, began. "Mr. Cole, did you authorize the activation of Clause 17B prior to the Carter Design acquisition?" Damien's jaw tightened. The clause was part of a standard restructuring agreement. Arthur leaned slightly forward. "Standard, perhaps, but not legal. Your digital signature on the trigger order predated the shareholder notification by 72 hours. That's securities fraud. A murmur ran through the room. The lead investigator adjusted her glasses. Mr. Cole, how do you explain this discrepancy? Damien smiled, but it was brittle. Clerical error. Arthur slid a document across the table. Then perhaps you can explain why your offshore account received a $2.8 million transfer from that same shell company 36 hours later. The click of camera shutters punctuated the silence that followed. Lila didn't look at him. She stared instead at the edge of the table, tracing the grain of the wood as if grounding herself. She could hear her father's voice again, not in words, but in the calm precision he used when drawing a straight line. She imagined him saying, "Truth doesn't shout, it measures." And she was measuring now every pause, every denial, every breath of a man who thought he'd built walls too high to be reached. The evidence continued: emails, wire transfers, internal memos. Each document Arthur presented was a strike. Each answer Damien gave was a retreat. Finally, Arthur leaned back. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly, "you once told an employee she should remember her place. Would you like to tell this room what your place is now?" Damien's pen rolled off the table and hit the floor. He didn't pick it up. The lead investigator cleared her throat. "The panel will adjourn for deliberation." As she stood, so did everyone else. Lila stayed seated a moment longer, letting the noise fade. She wasn't proud, she wasn't angry, she was simply finished. Arthur placed a hand on her arm. "He's done," he said. She nodded once. It's not about him anymore. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with light. Reporters surged forward, microphones, extended voices, overlapping questions about motive, legacy, forgiveness. Lila paused at the top of the steps. The crowd below went silent, waiting for a soundbite, a headline, something loud. What she gave them was quiet. "My father taught me that integrity isn't a word. It's a habit," she said. "Some people spend their lives unlearning it. I just came here to remind them what it looks like." The wind carried her voice just far enough for the microphones to catch every syllable. Then she turned and walked away. Inside a quiet conference room upstairs, Arthur signed the final affidavit. The civil suit had been settled in Lila's favor, full restitution of her father's assets, plus a public admission of misconduct. It wasn't just money. It was acknowledgement. He looked out the window at the street below, where people were still gathered, talking softly in clusters. "You know," he said, "most cases end with compromise. This one ended with conscience." Lila looked out beside him. It didn't end. It just balanced. Arthur smiled. That's the best anyone can ask for. That evening she went back to the Selborne. Not as an employee, not as a symbol, just as someone revisiting the room where it had all started. The restaurant was closed for renovation. Through the glass she could see workers removing the last of the old decor. The marble floor gleamed under the construction lights. Her reflection stared back at her older, steadier. She whispered quietly to the empty room, "You remember." A few weeks later, headlines read, "Coal Industries CEO resigns amid scandal. Carter family wins restitution foundation announced." A small note at the end of one article mentioned a new non-profit organization, the Marin Carter Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of corporate fraud. Its slogan was simple: audit of grace. Its emblem was a single upright line carved into a circle: stand, quietly stand true. Spring came softly that year. The city, restless and loud as ever, began to move past the scandal, but not forget it. Power had changed shape just enough for people to notice. On the corner of West 72nd, the Selborne reopened after renovation. The invitation was plain white embossed in silver: grand reopening and dedication ceremony in honor of Robert Carter. Lila Carter read the card twice before deciding to go. When she arrived, the building looked both new and familiar. The glass doors shone brighter, the walls lighter, the chandeliers no longer blinding. Inside, the air carried no arrogance, only quiet curiosity. At the entrance stood a brass plaque. The lettering was simple, designed by Robert Carter, restored by his daughter. People moved around her, taking photos, admiring the space, unaware that the woman in the black coat was the same one who had once been humiliated on this very floor. Arthur Marin found her near the window. "You made it," he said. She smiled. "So did you." He nodded toward the plaque. "It's fitting, isn't it? A man who built beauty in silence and a daughter who turned silence into justice." She didn't answer right away. Her gaze was fixed on the marble beneath her feet. It was the same floor, repolished, unchanged, except for the light that touched it differently now. A small crowd gathered near the stage. The new owner of the restaurant, a quiet, soft-spoken woman, took the microphone. She thanked the staff, the architects, the donors. Then she paused, looking toward Lila. "There's someone here who reminded this city what dignity means," she said. "We owe her the chance to speak." Lila shook her head slightly, but the applause was already rising. She stepped up to the small platform, her heart calm. The microphone hummed softly as she spoke. "I'm not here to talk about the past," she began. "It speaks for itself." The room quieted. Even the waiters stopped moving. "My father used to say buildings are like people. They remember how they were treated. You can repaint the walls, polish the floor, change the name, but what it holds stays. This place held humiliation once. Tonight it holds grace. And that's enough." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. It was the kind of steadiness that only comes from having already lost everything and learned what can't be taken. She stepped down to polite, quiet applause. Arthur met her halfway. "Do you realize he said you just closed the loop?" She smiled faintly. "I think the floor did that for me." Later, when most of the guests had gone, she lingered alone in the empty dining room. The city lights outside shimmered through the glass, casting long reflections across the marble. She walked to the exact spot where Damien Cole had once stood, where 100 eyes had watched her defy him. The same space that had witnessed humiliation now felt peaceful. She knelt not in submission, but in remembrance. Her fingers brushed the cold surface. "We're even," she whispered. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, washing the glass windows clean. Arthur appeared by the doorway, his voice low. "You know the world still wants to interview you. Documentaries, talk shows." Lila smiled. "Let them tell their own stories. I've told mine." He nodded slowly. "What will you do now?" "Keep building," she said. "Something honest." Months later, the Marin Carter Foundation opened its first office, a small space overlooking the river. The logo was simple, a single upright line carved into a circle. Beneath it the words, "Stand quietly. Stand true." The foundation supported whistleblowers, small business owners, and employees who'd faced retaliation. They called it the Audit of Grace. People began sending letters, handwritten, grateful, trembling, with the same quiet courage Lila once needed. Some enclosed photos, others just words, "You reminded me to stand." She kept them all in a small wooden box on her desk. One evening, she returned to the Selborne for dinner just as a guest this time. The pianist played softly. The new staff moved easily between tables. When she stood to leave, the manager stopped her. "Miss Carter," he said, "there's something I thought you should see." He led her to the far wall where a glass case had been installed. Inside it lay a single gold pen. The plaque below read, "The Cost of Silence." It had been surrendered as evidence, then donated after the case closed. Now it sat behind glass stripped of power, preserved as a warning. Lila stared at it for a long time. The object that had once signed away her father's legacy now stood behind glass. She smiled not out of pride, but closure. As she stepped out into the night, the city hummed as it always had, impatient, alive. The rain had stopped. The streets glistened under the streetlights. Behind her, the restaurant glowed softly through its tall windows, filled with people, talking, laughing, living. No one remembered the exact details anymore, just that once a woman refused to kneel, and the world stood up. If you've ever been made to feel small in a place you helped build, remember this. The ground remembers who stood tall upon it. Time doesn't erase truth, it polishes it until it shines. And if this story stayed with you, let it remind you that grace isn't surrender. It's what remains standing when everything else has fallen.